It is time to meet our guest speaker this evening. So I'd like to introduce you to Dr. David Albrecht. He is the Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences Division at Norwich University. He also directs the online Masters of Arts in History and in Military History programs since 2017. Previously, Albrecht worked as a civilian historian at the United States Army Engineer School in Missouri. He has also co-authored several books, including World War II, A Global History, and Ways of War. In addition to academic roles, Albrecht worked as a historical consultant and on-air segment host for the award-winning Echoes of War, Stories from the Big Red One. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in introducing David Albrecht.
Thank you so much. I want to thank Laura Sears and Jackie Gillespie and the entire staff here at Cantini. I've been interacting with the staff here at Cantini for about 15 years now, and I'm always excited to come back and interact some more. And they always treat their guest speakers very, very well. So with that, I'm going to give you a very brief overview of the Anglo-American strategy leading up to Operation Torch in November 1942. It was Germany first, sort of. The reality is, until 1943, a majority of American material was actually going to the Pacific, but at least on paper, it was Germany first, focusing on Germany, defeating Germany, and then leaving Japan to be the secondary adversary. So in terms of how to defeat Germany, there were two different approaches. The Americans and the Soviets wanted to do a cross-channel invasion from the United Kingdom into France as early as 1942 or 1943. And the Soviets wanted the Americans and the British to draw forces away from the Eastern Front. And the British, for their part, favored an indirect approach. Winston Churchill and his advisors wanted the Allies to, attack the soft underbelly of the Axis powers. I actually think probably Winston Churchill wanted to make up for the fiasco of Gallipoli also. So there's a lot going on. He's a very complex individual. The British went out, and this was not just a sort of political decision, though it was also pragmatic. There simply weren't enough landing craft and enough lift capability, logistical lift capability to land on mainland Europe. So they decided to land on North Africa instead. So leading up to the landing, Operation Torch, November 8th, 1942, Bernard Law Montgomery and Erwin Rommel were pushing each other back and forth across North Africa. And basically the lines had solidified along the border with Egypt at the first and second battles of El Alamein, and with this battle of the victory by the British of the Battle of El Alamein, Rommel ends up having to retreat westward towards Tunisia, and Montgomery slowly chased him across the coastline. All right, so planning for Operation Torch at the sort of operational level is already ongoing, and the Anglo-Americans decide to land in three areas, near Casablanca, and near Iran, and in Algiers, along the northern coast of North Africa, or the coast of North Africa. This ends up being a challenge because the distance between Casablanca and Algiers is about 1,200 miles. So the British are landing at Algiers, and the Americans landing at Casablanca have to travel another 1,200 miles to reach where the British are. The goal is for Montgomery to chase Rommel westward towards Tunisia, and then and have the Anglo-Americans who are landing on Torch to move eastward, essentially trapping Rommel in Tunisia. That's the plan. And of course, as we know from the 19th century Prussian general Helmuth von Moltke, no plan survives contact with the enemy. All right, so for the Allied side, the key players are Major General Lloyd Friedenhall, who will be the II Corps commander and will be running the Oran landing. Major General Terry de la Mesa Allen, Terry Allen, who is the commanding general of the the First Infantry Division, and Dwight D. Eisenhower. He's a two-star general in the photograph, but he ends up being a lieutenant general at this time. He gets promoted, and he's the overall commander. And then there's Major General George S. Patton Jr., who's going to handle the Casablanca landings, and Rear Admiral Hewitt, who is going to accompany the Casablanca landings. So this was on a scale, this was much harder in many ways than making the D-Day invasion on June 6, 1944, where the Allies basically massed in southern England, sailed 100 miles south, and there you are. Patton and some 30-some thousand American soldiers needed to leave from Virginia and sail 4,200 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, which is swarming with wolf packs, the U-boats. And the other two forces, the Friedenhall and the British, left from England, and they had to sail about 1,200 miles. And this is all through, as I said, U-boat-infested waters. And so that ends up being a great challenge, and there's several hundred warships and several hundred transports that they're using. To put this in perspective, there's at least 500 transports that are transporting men and material, a total of 107,000 troops that will land on North Africa. To put that in perspective, just 3 months earlier, there were only 90 transport ships that landed the Marines, 18,000 Marines in Guadalcanal. And of course, that's just, 7 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, and this is 11 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor. So the ramping up of this was challenging, and it's an impressive feat to have made this trip across the Atlantic Ocean or southward from England around the Rock of Gibraltar and into the Mediterranean. They had to contend also with German air power as they got closer to North Africa and, of course, Sicily and Sardinia. So this is another map showing the different divisions, or task force, the Western, Center, and Eastern task forces. And I'll start with Morocco. That would have been the Western task force there, near just down the coast from Casablanca is Safi. This is a photograph of some landing craft being sailed onto the beach at Safi. You can see the transport ship there, and as with all good amphibious assaults, there's a pre-invasion, bombardment, and then as the troops are landing, the American warships will get in as close as they can, sometimes risking running aground to provide direct fire and counter battery fire with the defensive forces. So in this photograph, you see some of the fortified gun emplacements that the French held and that they had been destroyed. And this photograph is also of Americans raising the flag over at one of the fortifications. Casablanca, those attacks end up getting the most resistance from the French Navy. The French Navy was still smarting from the decision Churchill made to destroy to destroy as many French warships as possible earlier in the war. He sailed the Royal Navy up to southern France and bombarded and destroyed several warships. So the French sailors were very bitter. But the overwhelming force of the U.S. Navy was enough to silence the French Navy and then also silence the gun emplacements on the ground. So next we'll leapfrog over to the easternmost landing and look at Algiers and Algeria. These are British and American soldiers. The 34th Infantry Division was accompanied by a British division, and they landed. And in each place there is some resistance, but it just takes a day or 2 or 3 days at each of these landings for the Anglo-Americans to crush the resistance. And basically, even the French ground forces may want to, fight on, but they soon understand that it's fruitless to fight on. And then we come to the 1st Infantry Division at Oran in Algeria. So the key commanders for the 1st Infantry Division are Brigadier General Teddy Roosevelt Jr. You can see him on the left there, the far left, with the 1 star on his helmet, and then Terrible Terry Allen, who is the commanding general of the division. The other 2 photographs are Americans loading on to landing craft and then riding landing craft into the Oran area. Here's an aerial photograph, sort of looking sort of westward. You can see the north is a little bit on an angle because of the way the photograph is. But when the 1st Infantry Division and the other units landed at Oran, there was an attempt to make a direct attack on the city proper. But then other units landed to the east and to the west and would converge on Oran overland. And as Major General Allen himself commanded one of the regiments that landed to the east of the city of Oran, and as he's moving westward, they're always running into trouble. There's some obviously trouble with, bringing in more supplies, ammunition, reinforcements, and other, the French and the roads and everything else. And he said that nothing in hell must delay or stop this attack. So Major General Allen was a very aggressive commander, not necessarily one to favor rules. He was not a martinet in any way, shape, or form, which would get him a bad reputation with senior officers, some of them anyway. But when it came to caring for his men and being a leader that was in the fight, he had had established that sort of culture and that sort of leadership. So by about November 11th, those landings, those assaults have consolidated. There's a beachhead, and then the Americans began the long trek, some 1,200 miles, some 6 or 7, some 300 miles, eastward across the northern coast of Africa to try to get to Tunis and Tunisia. And the landings are in early November, and then then it's not until January and February that they're able to start actually fighting the Germans, and so there's a long process. And at night it gets very cold there. In the day it's a desert. So one of the things I think sometimes Americans are sort of hardwired to do is to fight in temperate climates, sort of like Northern Europe and North America. Well, this would have been, a desert, arid, not a lot of natural water. And so if you've got, you have more than 107,000 soldiers moving eastward by this time. Each one needs a couple of gallons of water each day, at least. A couple of gallons weighs 16 pounds times 100,000 men at just 100,000 men. You've got a lot of water that you need to transport, a lot of water. And then we're talking food and mail and everything else. And so it is a long trek. Meanwhile, Erwin Rommel is able to retreat faster than Montgomery can advance, so he arrives with the Afrika Corps in Tunisia about the same time the Americans do, and so he tries to set up some defenses in Tunisia to stop the Americans. He hopes to knock out the Americans or disable the American advance, and then he'll wheel around to deal with Montgomery coming westward across from Egypt. Of course, the Germans seem to do this again and again. They're going to block one side and try to knock out one set of enemies and then wheel around and then knock out the other set of enemies. We see this over and over and over again in the 20th century in German military history. It's just kind of interesting to me. Some things, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Or as Mark Twain says, history does not repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. So, General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel is on the left there, and he is commanding the Afrika Corps, but he sort of shares command with General Oberst H.J. von Arnim. H.J. von Arnim. And there's tension between these two generals. The Feldmarschall outweighs the Colonel General. The Field Marshal outweighs the Colonel General in rank, but they're both reporting to Albert Kesselring, who's based in Italy, and that's at sort of, Kesselring is sort of Eisenhower's opposite number, the theater commander, in terms of operational decision-making. But the overall Mediterranean strategy is actually decided by the General Staff of Italy. And so basically there's wiggle room before these two generals to compete with each other or to ignore each other. And, you know, von Arnim is not as cooperative with Rommel as Rommel would have liked. So there's command problems, command structure problems in the German military. All right, so this is the area of Tunisia, and this will be our area of operations as we move into two key battles, not just for the campaign, but also for the 1st Infantry Division. These are two battles that are key to both the history of the 1st Infantry Division and to this campaign. So one of the things that is found, that is discovered very quickly by the Americans, that artillery and tanks really matter. Artillery and tanks really matter. The U.S. Army has a number of problems with command and control and with, you know, separation of forces and Major General Friedenhall, who's the II Corps commanding general, wants to spread out all the regiments in the 1st Division and the 1st Infantry Division and 9th Armored Division, spread them out over, 100 miles or so, and deal with the regimental commanders, even the battalion commanders, and he ends up relegating Major General Terry Allen to kind of watch on, and that's very problematic. But one thing that does come out is that American artillery, once it gets sighted in, is devastating, absolutely devastating. You have a 105 millimeter howitzer there behind the wall, and of course the Germans have their 88 millimeter high velocity gun too. It's an anti-tank weapon that's sort of a standalone weapon, and then you see it in the King Tiger, or the Tiger 1, the King Tiger 1 tank, which also mounts that 88 millimeter, and that's just an absolutely devastating weapon. It's high velocity, it has a flat trajectory, great range, great accuracy, and it was either mounted on a tank or as an anti-tank weapon or as to provide direct or indirect fire as conventional artillery. This was a devastating weapon, and those two photographs are on the right there. So we get up to talk about the Battle of Kasserine Pass. And the Battle of Kasserine Pass lasts 4 to 5 days, really, the 19th to 23rd February 1943. So we're, 3 months, 3.5 months from the actual invasion as the Americans are pushing the battle was not planned for or even expected from the American perspective. This was actually a battle initiated by Erwin Rommel. And he had hoped that farther to the north, he had hoped that von Arnim would end up helping him to attack the northern part of the American line. Von Arnim attacked a few miles, but then he stopped and held his ground and gradually withdrew. He was not as aggressive as Rommel was. Rommel, as I was listening to various blogs and presentations online as I was driving, making a big drive a couple weeks ago, and one of the blogs I said was, if you look at what Rommel's trying to do, right here, he's trying to push through Kasserine Pass. He's trying to get to a couple of little towns that are key logistics hubs. He's almost doing on a smaller version what the Battle of the Bulge, what the Germans were trying to do with the Battle of the Bulge. Push through and destroy the Allied logistics hub at Antwerp. Well, Rommel wanted to push through and get to Trebessa, I think it is, and capture that, either capture it intact and ideally get the supplies. And that supply depot would have set the Americans back months to do the refit necessary and to move the supplies up close to the front. So this photograph is looking southeastward down the Kasserine Pass. So looking from up here down this direction. And you can see there are mountainous regions on both sides of this pass, but it's a forbidding pass, and it would be very easy for either side's artillery or tanks or air power to dominate that. It's a choke point, really. So, looking southwest. And those are the two key supplies that Rommel is in the red, and he's trying to get to those two key supplies. So, this is where Major General Friedenhall on the left there makes some serious mistakes. First of all, he spends most of his time 50 or even 100 miles back from the front in what amounts to a cave dug into the side of one of the mountains. He's not very active at the front. He also tries to bypass Major General Allen, and he spreads his forces out piecemeal. He has a couple of divisions under his command and troops and units beside that, but he stretches them out over, say, a 100-mile front in battalion or regiment size, and they're not connected. They're not connected. One regiment might be 5 miles away from the other, but that's 5 miles up and down a mountain, and by crow flies, it's 5 miles. By the way the tank drives, it might be 25 or 30 miles. And there's little narrow dirt roads or sandy roads, so there's no way to make that trip quickly. I believe that Eisenhower tried to make a 400-mile trip from Algiers to the front, and or rather a 200-mile trip one way, and he ends up spending 4 to 5 hours on the road, and he's just not moving very quickly at all. So everything moves slowly, and there's not good communication. So command, control, and communication is very problematic. Here's a more detailed map of Rommel's attack to the northwest. Coming this direction, he'd be coming up towards us. If that's Kasserine, the village of Kasserine, he's coming up towards the pass, and he runs into Force Stark. Colonel Stark was commanding the 1st Battalion of the 18th Infantry Regiment, 1st Infantry Division, and he was there to kind of block that advance, and he was very quickly overwhelmed because Rommel sensed that there was weakness, and Rommel committed a good portion of a panzer division to try to steamroll the Americans. And so he gets pushed out of the way, and then Rommel begins to split up his forces, going to Tobessa, going up towards Thala, and running along the front lines. He runs over the initial force led by Colonel Stark, and that's where a lot of the people kind of stop with the Battle of El Ghoutar. As Dr. Robert Citino has argued, if you look at, Kasserine Pass, I'm sorry. If you look at Kasserine Pass, if you look at that first day or two, it looks like a big defeat. But as the Germans push further and further into the American lines, they don't reach Tobessa, they don't reach Thala. Instead, reinforcements come up. Those Americans that had been retreating began to turn and fight, and Rommel is not able to reach his objectives. So by February 23rd, Rommel's advance has stopped, short of his objective of reaching the supply depots. And indeed, he is quickly forced back. And one of the key elements stopping him was American artillery. They would get the target zeroed in this little relatively narrow space, and American 105s and 155s would rain hell down on the Germans. And there are explanations by German officers and German soldiers that they couldn't move, they couldn't think, they couldn't see because of all the smoke and the dust, and they're just basically sitting ducks that are getting plastered by American military. All right, so by February 23rd, the German advance is stopped, and Rommel has stretched out his own supply lines. He's got this bulge running into the American lines, and he's in danger of being cut off. That bulge, that advance into American lines, is in danger of being cut off, so he must retreat. He's basically invested a lot of gasoline, a lot of lives, a lot of time, a lot of tanks, and he doesn't have anything to take away from it. So he ends up retreating. Now, Friedenthal gets blamed for the first day or two of the fiasco at Kasserine Pass, and historians pretty much agree that he was hardly the ideal commander for this sort of situation. He had been an outstanding trainer of soldiers back in the American home front, and he was a senior officer, so they believed that he could exercise good command in the field, but he was pretty much his own worst enemy. He didn't visit the front as much as he should have, and like I said, he would isolate division staff and division staff and commanding generals, and he cut up his two divisions and the other supporting forces in such a way that he could not concentrate. There was no economy of force or concentration of force. There's one episode right before the Battle of Kasserine Pass where 45 or 50 American tanks are moving southeastward a little bit further than Kasserine Pass, and they're trying to make a run at the Germans, and they run into an ambush where they're in this pass, and then the German 88s, anti-tank 88s, and the German tanks also with the 88s are on both sides, and they destroy all but 4 or 5 of those tanks. And so he sets everything up piecemeal, and then that basically caters to Rommel, who is thinking blitzkrieg, and he's going to concentrate his forces and try to punch holes through the American lines and get into some open field running. So Friedenthal is relieved by Dwight D. Eisenhower, and George S. Patton is given command of 2 corps. And of course, we've all seen the scenes in the movie Patton with George C. Scott playing the title role, and he comes in and starts enforcing strict discipline. And that part of that movie is certainly very factual. But again, the forces under Friedenthal, so the 1st Division and the 9th Armored Division, they ended up stopping the German advance and holding their ground. So Kasserine Pass was not the ultimate disaster. Yes, they got taken by surprise and run over, and there's many casualties, but it's not a complete defeat by any stretch. So up to the north, the Anglo-American forces up north facing off against Van Arnhem are fighting back and forth through the mountainous terrain. In this map we see the Germans are trying to attack westward, the Americans will counterattack, the Germans will counterattack, and that's happening in February into March. Now as we get to mid-March, we come to the Battle of El Ghoutar. And El Ghoutar will be a victory for the United States and will help to very much reestablish or establish the First Infantry Division's sort of sense of prestige, sense of self, confidence, discipline, and that sort of thing. So it's a very important battle. It also breaks the back of Rommel's defenses in this sector. So here's the area of operations. It's hard to read, but this little village here is El Ghoutar, and you can see that the Americans will be converging from various directions to run through this pass at El Ghoutar, and then the other American forces are moving eastward along the line. So we're going to focus on El Ghoutar. So here are some photographs of the terrain and some of the supply issues that the Americans were dealing with. Here's a soldier with a rope guiding a donkey. In sort of difficult terrain, a mule rather. A mule would be a very good animal that would be sure-footed, maybe a little stubborn, but sure-footed, and would be a very effective transportation mode. And if you had a couple of mules, you could load a 75 millimeter pack howitzer on them. That's why they called it the pack howitzer, because you could pack it on a couple of mules. It's also at El Ghoutar that the Americans continue to perfect this artillery arm. They perfect combined arms operations. So that's tanks and infantry and artillery working together in a coordinated way. And the Germans just really found American artillery to be absolutely devastating. And here is some of the results of the artillery barrages. That was a tracked vehicle, a tank or an armored car at one point, half-track at one point, and you can see it's been completely destroyed. Not just a little bit destroyed, completely destroyed. So the 1st Infantry Division is very instrumental in the victory at El Ghoutar, and this artillery is also very instrumental. So I want to read a direct quote from the Chief of Staff in the division, 1st Infantry Division, Colonel Stanhope Mason, and he writes this. The vaunted 10th, quote, the vaunted 10th Panzer Division deployed its tanks across the width of the valley and in such depth that it appeared to be a square. This is looking at El Ghoutar. Behind the tanks, the infantry, some in armored personnel carriers, were also formed in boxes as opposed to being widely deployed in lines. Our artillery, our American artillery, held its fire until they were 8,000 yards from the guns and then opened fire with every gun. The results were devastating. Here and there, a tank would take a direct hit and burst into flame. Anything, men, tanks, caught in the back and forth sweeping fire, had no safe direction to go. Even so, the German advance moved closer. The American military's mortars and machine guns became effective as they moved within 1,000 yards or even closer than that. The German infantry scattered. Some tanks continued to advance, their cannon firing steadily. The German tanks were stopped before they got into our rear areas. About half of them were on the field burning, some others were simply demobilized, and others were making their way back toward their starting position. And this description would fit the very sort of famous scene in the movie Patton, where Patton basically catches the Germans out in the open and basically is calling in artillery and tank fire from 3 directions. And so that's essentially the similar sort of situation. So when we get up to April and into May, the British under Montgomery have arrived, and the British are pushing northward up the coast in this direction. The Anglo-American forces coming in from the east are pushing. This is Tunisia, and basically the Germans don't have anywhere to go. There's 200-some thousand Germans and Italians defending that area, and they can't get any more supplies. They're running out of ammunition. And Rommel is having some health problems. He flies back and forth to Berlin during this time frame and tries to ask Adolf Hitler to let him surrender, and Adolf Hitler refuses. And eventually, Rommel is called back to Berlin for ostensibly for health reasons, and he leaves von Arnim to surrender the forces. And this is a photograph of all the captured German forces. On 13 May 1943 is when the Afrika Corps and von Arnim's forces and the Italian forces in the area all have to surrender. All right, counting the Allied costs. Here's a photograph of the American cemetery in Tunisia. 19,000 Americans were casualties during the operations in North Africa. Of those, almost 4,000 were casualties from the 1st Infantry Division. Now keep in mind, an infantry division has approximately 16,000 men. So now granted they would be getting replacements and some reinforcements, but that's still a very sizable number. If you look at all the men that served in the 1st Infantry Division in World War II as a whole, it's about 45,000 at any given time served in the 1st Infantry Division, and there was about 20,000 casualties. So almost a 50% casualty rate for the 1st Infantry Division from North Africa to Sicily, D-Day, and then on into Aachen and the Battle of the Bulge. The British Commonwealth casualties were much greater because they had been fighting for that territory for a year or two longer than the Americans had, so the British Commonwealth casualties amounted to 200,000. Here's a quote, or here's a excerpt from a letter that Terry Allen wrote to his wife right after the Battle of El Ghoutar. And he says, "Our losses have been considerable and are saddening. Of course, many wounded will be back on duty, but there are a great many who will never come back. On the whole, our losses have been comparatively minor compared to the accomplishments of the division. Most of our infantry rifle companies are now down to 1 rifle platoon." That's really not a good thing. Anyway, he doesn't say that, that's my parenthetical comment. It has been a terrific responsibility, and I don't think that's the good kind of terrific, responsibility to have the division during this period. Because very frankly, we had to win, and the 1st Division had to set the pace. And then he gives a little window into his personal beliefs and his personal life, his personality, his faith. I have attended Mass quite frequently and have received communion quite regularly. I always pray that our plan of operations will work with the least losses to the division. So you really get an idea of what Major General Allen was like just from this letter home to his wife, and he was very, very popular with his men. He does get relieved because Omar Bradley doesn't like his sort of cantankerous attitude and his apparent lack of discipline and unwillingness to have the perfect uniform all the time. But Alan will resurrect himself, and later on, after D-Day, he will command another division in the fight across Europe. So, Allied victory, almost done. Allied victory in Tunisia is 13 May 1943. 620,000 German and Italian casualties total in North Africa. Total. Including the 250,000 Germans and Italians that surrendered in Tunisia in May of 1943. February to May was very bad for the Germans and for the Axis powers in general. The Battle of Stalingrad will end in February of 1943. 500,000 German casualties will be suffered just in fighting in and around Stalingrad. That doesn't count 250,000 Hungarians, Romanians, and others that are fighting in the entire campaign. Only 91,000 will be taken, not only, but 91,000 will be taken prisoners of war from Stalingrad. The Battle of the Atlantic the shift will occur in mid-1943 as 50 Allied merchant ships would be sunk per month. But then when we get into 1944, 20 merchant ships would be sunk. And if you go back to 1942 as those convoys are trying to make their way across, maybe 100 merchant ships per month were being sunk. American industrial might basically were cranking out more Liberty ships than the Germans could hope to sink by 1943. So it's a turning point. The Battle of Guadalcanal is over in February. Now, you have 20,000 Japanese casualties, not really on the scale of 200,000 in Europe, but Guadalcanal, a 6-month campaign, does show the weakness of Japanese logistics and Japanese strategy. Finally, in New Guinea, you have a 2-year campaign commanded by Douglas MacArthur, where the Americans and the Australians are pushing the Japanese across the northern coast of New Guinea, and the Japanese will lose 165,000 men in those two years. So the rest of the story in Europe, in July of 1943, the Americans and the British will land on Sicily. September, in the boot of Italy, and then work their way up, and Rome will be liberated in early June 1944, about the same time that D-Day will occur. So, I am ready for questions.
All right, everybody. Before we get to our Q&A, just a couple quick notes. For our guests who are joining us in person this evening, we're going to do this old-fashioned style. Should you have a question tonight, go ahead and raise your hand. The only thing I'm going to ask you to do is please wait for the microphone. Our friend Antonio in the back of the room, he's going to wave his hand for us right now, will be running the microphone to all of our guests. We want to make sure our guests who are joining us on Zoom hear your amazing questions tonight. For our guests who are joining us virtually on Zoom, you can get questions to us by utilizing the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. In fact, we do have some questions already in through Zoom, so I'm going to throw it over to my friend Jackie, and she will get you the first question.
All righty.
All right, our first question is, why were no U.S. Marine Corps units involved in any amphibious operations in Europe, while in the Pacific theater, substantially more Army troops than Marines fought in combat? Was this a case of World War II inter-service rivalry?
Short version, yes. Of course, I'm actually a Marine Corps historian by training. My first book is on Marine Corps history, so I'm but then I worked for the Corps of Engineers, so I got a little confused. Anyway, as World War II was spinning up in January, February, March 1942, it was just basically a deal cut by Marshall and Admiral Leahy and President Roosevelt and Admiral Ernest King that the war in the Central Pacific was going to be a Navy war. Of course, Douglas MacArthur was a force of nature, and so he was going to get the love and be able to, fight along New Guinea, and that's going to be its own theater, which is going to be both Navy and Army working together. And then the U.S. Army, supported by the U.S. Navy, was going to fight in Europe. Now, why weren't there Marines? Well, for one thing, a lot of the Marines were focusing by this time in the Pacific. The Marines scraped together one division for Guadalcanal in August of 1942, and then by the time we get up to November of 1942, the Marines are beginning to work their way up the slot and moving on to islands like Bougainville and those sorts of things. So the Marines there's not enough Marines to go around to do the job they needed to do in the Pacific. But I can say that there were Marine observers, and there were Marines that were involved with the planning and advising the planning for North Africa.
Well, at the beginning of World War II, there were only 41,000 Marines in the whole Marine Corps. So therefore, they didn't have the manpower to fight on both stations. And they were the amphibious landing experts. They had the more experience because they have done it before, and that was why they were in the Pacific.
Right. And in July of 1941, the 1st Marine Division and the 1st Infantry Division did do joint operation or joint exercises, and they were assaulting the beaches and so on. So this would have been Howling Mad Smith and Teddy Roosevelt Jr. And if my memory serves me correctly, the naval commander that's working on those exercises for the U.S. Navy was then Rear Admiral Ernest King. This is July 1941. So there had been thoughts that eventually there would need to be an amphibious assault of some sort in Europe, and the 1st Infantry Division did have some practice.
Could you please describe the impact of the ultra-secret code breaking during Operation Torch? Yes.
There's a lot of deception and counterintelligence that the Allies are doing. They are able to break the codes for the Germans, and the Germans were trying to resupply coming over from Italy or Sicily. There's just, a couple hundred miles, let's say, to North Africa, and they'd send their transports to resupply, bring supplies down from Europe to North Africa, evacuate wounded, those sorts of things. The Allies were at pains, though, to try to keep the Germans from figuring out whether or not they had, broken those codes. For example, if there's going to be a convoy leaving, Sicily and sailing south, and the Allies knew it, they would make sure that there was an American airplane just happened to be flying somewhere in the area, fairly conspicuously, so that, that's who radioed it in. So the code breaking and knowing the German plans to one degree or another, at least operational, strategic plans, sometimes tactical, was extremely important. And again, I can't overemphasize this logistics issue. Supply and transportation. The arid climate would wreak havoc on all vehicles. And of course, as we know, the Germans have very finely manufactured, machined vehicles with machined parts. They don't do well in the climate and the terrain and such of North Africa. So they need constant spare parts.
And, good evening, Professor. Lieutenant Commander Eric Grauender. I'm active duty Navy. I have a strong interest in military history myself. Operation Torch, primarily a land campaign. After the initial amphibious assault, when the Navy land in the Army, so on and so forth. In fairness, this went on until May 1943, so good 6+ months. You did make a brief reference that the Germans and Italians, they weren't able to get more supplies and such. As the campaign went on, was there a strong role by the Royal British Navy, the U.S. Navy, naval blockade, naval bombardment, naval air support? Was there any intervention by the Italian Navy, for example, since they were based out of Taranto, Italy? How much of a naval conflict, if any, was there after the initial landings?
All right, so one of the two key British bases in the Mediterranean would be Gibraltar, the Rock of Gibraltar, which was British held. And of course, the British were always paranoid that Franco and Spain would jump in on the Axis side. And then Spain also controlled Spanish Morocco, and basically across the little channel from Gibraltar. Gibraltar, it's a hard word to say, Gibraltar, you know what I'm trying to say. Anyway, when the British Royal Navy had substantial forces there. They had 2 aircraft carriers and 3 battleships assigned to Gibraltar. And then also Malta, much easier word to say, Malta. Malta ends up being key to the lifeline coming through the Suez Canal for supplies. Malta is constantly being bombed and attacked by sea and German naval, Italian naval, German air power, and so on. But that becomes sort of an unsinkable aircraft carrier in that there's the runway there that serves as a base for operations in sort of the central and eastern Mediterranean. So what the British end up doing primarily is to basically maintain those 2 bases of operation, Gibraltar and Malta. I can only imagine what the closed caption is going to do with this. Anyway, Gibraltar and Malta, and then cut off the supplies. The Italian Navy was formidable. However, when you're talking about the Anglo-Americans establishing air superiority, not supremacy, air superiority, and having several of the battleships there, they're not going to have that much of an effect. And if you want to know more about the naval war, Vincent O'Hara has written several books on Torch, both the land operations, but he's an absolute expert on the naval operations in the Mediterranean during the entire war. So Vincent O'Hara is good. I went ahead and splashed some good books if you're interested in some of the best reads about the campaign itself, the battles itself, but then also the Mediterranean war as a whole.
The conference between Roosevelt and Churchill that went on about the same time, did it have any effect on operations and how things went forward there?
Yeah, Casablanca, you mean? Is that? They were watching what was happening on the battlefield, but Casablanca was looking much further into the war. They were setting up the concept of, looking towards unconditional surrender. They were arguing back and forth. Well, not arguing. Anyway, they were planning back and forth for an eventual cross-channel invasion. As things worked out, the British were able to impose their will yet again in 1943, going to Sicily and then on to Italy. But Casablanca is more diplomatic in dealing with how to keep this coalition together, how to keep the Americans and the British cooperating, and then also figuring out some way to pacify or help the Soviet Union. The last thing that the Americans and the British wanted was for the Soviets to give up or surrender or sign a separate peace. So it was both sides that was like, all right, the British and the Americans are liking the fact that the Soviets are fighting because that's absorbing millions of Germans. And the Soviets want the Americans and the British to be more active on the continent to absorb, millions of Germans. So both sides want the same thing, but East versus West.
All right, so we have a lot of questions coming in here in the Zoom. So I do want to ask, can you talk a little bit about any military from Africa that participated in this invasion?
There were some French colonial troops that would have been initially loyal to or controlled by Vichy France. There would have been also local scouts and that sort of thing. But I'm going to fall back on my PhD and say, I don't know. I've got a PhD so I can say, I don't know once. But now I've done it, so I'm in real trouble.
All right, we have another question over here. Could you talk a little bit about Allied prisoners of war during this campaign? How many were there by the end?
All right, so out of the 19,000 total casualties, American casualties in North Africa, that's killed, wounded, missing action, or prisoners of war, it was, my recollection is about 10% of that number, maybe 2,000 prisoners of war in the whole campaign, beginning at Torch and moving forward. They would be basically, depending on where they were captured, they would end up in Tunisia, in Tunis, in the city of Tunis, and then actually, in some cases, they were flown, not taken by ship, but flown to Italy. There's one of the soldiers, one of the 1st Infantry Division soldiers that I was reading about, ended up going to Italy for 6 months or so, and then ends up in Eastern Germany, modern-day Poland, and as the Russians are pushing westward in 1944 and 45, the Germans keep moving this guy around. He was in one of the stalags there. So eventually, they would make their way to the stalags in Germany. But again, to transport prisoners is a logistical challenge too. It's absolutely a logistical challenge.
What was the thinking behind Friedenhall's decision to disperse those troops so far apart?
He had a number of holes to plug. Obviously, the Kasserine Pass is the biggest pass, but you can see that there, to the north of that area of operation, you had von Arnim that's going to attack westward, and so he wanted to spread his troops out, I think, to plug the holes. I think he was a victim of circumstance in some ways, because Kasserine Pass is the first significant battle that Americans are involved in. So the Americans are green. Of course, the Germans are they're veterans, they're very tough, and they have, this very aggressive leader. So on some levels, Friedenhall is just really the wrong person at the wrong place at the wrong time, but he was also, I think, his own worst enemy, because he's not up with the front. And I think it's plugging the holes. But then he's going to have to rely on reserves and reinforcements, and basically that bulge doesn't quite get to Bessa, but it gets close, and then it's basically reinforcements from the 1st Armored, I believe, that help to turn them back. So I think he's trying to plug a number of holes, but he's not involving the division staffs the way he should have. He's basically screwing up chain of command and screwing up chain of command, centralized authority.
So we have time for 2 more questions. I'm going to ask one here on the Zoom. Can you talk a little bit about submarine operations for both the Axis and the Allies? These long supply lines over water absolutely must have made for easy pickings.
Yeah. The thing about the German U-boats, as I said, you've got 1942, which is the heyday of German U-boat effectiveness. The German U-boats are sinking 100 or more Allied ships a month. Then we dropped to about 50 during this time frame in early 1943, and as we moved to late 1943, the Allies are only losing 20 merchant ships a month. So of course, this is a combination of a variety of factors. American industry was simply building more Liberty ships than the Germans could sink. You also have improvements in sonar and radar. You have you have the intelligence and gathering that they're able to figure out where the wolf packs would be. And I think the other thing that the Americans and the British do is they stick to convoys. A convoy may take up 100 square miles, but there's whatever, 80, 100, 500 ships, however many there are in that convoy, but they can protect the convoy, and to sink any ships in that convoy, you've got to have a German submarine at the right place at the right time. If you contrast that with what the Japanese did, the Japanese never used convoys in World War II. The Japanese sent their merchant ships out singly, and so at any given time there's 400 or 500 merchant ships sailing around the Pacific, so that's really, really a target-rich environment for an American sub-commander. And of course, submarines would also have been, American submarines would have also been involved in the Mediterranean to some degree or another. But I'm going to refer you to Vincent O'Hara's work for more details on that. All right. So.
Hi. You mentioned Friedenhall being relieved. Can you talk about any of the other changes in leadership, doctrine, and maybe training coming out of the campaign, coming out of Kasserine Pass?
All right, so he's relieved after Kasserine Pass, and then Patton takes over and instills discipline. He goes back he goes back to the old days where discipline and training are very effective. He brings on Omar Bradley as his deputy commander. Patton would not hesitate to sack to relieve a subordinate commander that wasn't doing the job well enough. I think it's also kind of interesting. So he's two-corps commander, and then by the time you get to Tunisia at the very end in, say, April, May, Omar Bradley gets promoted to becoming two-corps commanding general because Patton is basically taken away to help plan for the invasion of Sicily. And so the difference in leadership style between Patton and Bradley is striking. The other thing about Bradley is that in the post-war years, of course Patton dies in 1945, in the post-war years I think Bradley lives till about 1980 or something. He lives a very long time. He tries to control the image, he tries to control the mythology about himself. And so he tries to be the soldier's general, and that is added, that's an Ernie Pyle invention. And it wasn't that he was not as, Omar Bradley was not as conspicuously grandiose and flamboyant as Patton was, but he was not quite the soldier's general, and he would absolutely also replace subordinates that did not function well in their commands. Well, thank you.